All right, welcome back, everybody. Wildlife Cake and Cocktails, episode 10, coming at you guys. We've got a great show for you guys today. I'm very excited. We're going to be talking land rehabilitation, a very, very important issue. So, of course, we have to have our setup first. Because we're talking mining, we have some dual mines. Not all of us, of course. Some of us are consummate professionals. The dual mine, 2 shots of whiskey, a 3/4 shot of pomegranate liqueur, bitters, ice and tonic.
Nice. Very nice.
Yes, quite lovely. And, you know, of course, we're talking land rehabilitation, so we have some Black Forest cake. It's a densely layered chocolate and cherry mayhem thing. And all vegan today as well for our fantastic guests. Well done. I'm very, very excited about this one. Look, over here to my left, my good buddy Adrian Carr from Griffith, Bachelor of Environmental Science graduate, Diploma of Project Management, and currently working at Habitat Bush Reveg.
That's the one, yep.
How you doing, mate?
Yeah, good, thank you.
Thank you for coming up to talk mine land rehab with us. I've known you for ages, and you've always been one of my kind of go-to guys to talk about bush regen. You know, you always seem to have had a wealth of knowledge, so I'm very happy to have you here, man. Thank you for showing up.
Thanking you.
Awesome, and I'm very excited about this. Over here, further to my left, we have Ms. Corinne Unger. She's done a Bachelor of Science, majoring in Geomorphology and Climatology with a Diploma of Education as well.
Yep, at the same time. Yep.
Wonderful. Dual degree. Down in New South Wales. Postgrad Diploma in Geoscience in Applied Geomorphology. She spent plenty of time in and around the mining industry in a variety of roles, from soil conservation to mine rehab. 10 years or so in the Northern Territory in planning and research as well.
Yep.
Wonderful. And then on to regulation within the Queensland Government and abandoned mine rehab. A self-employed environmental consultant for 9 years, working in Australia and overseas. Man, you've done everything. Awarded the James Love Churchill Fellowship in 2009 to study abandoned mine rehab and post-mining land use in Austria, Germany, England and Canada. Also a former senior research officer at the Centre for Mineland Research at the University of Queensland in early 2011. Helping support research and implementation of Australia's national policy for abandoned mines. Following a brief stint as an industry fellow there at the CMLR, she's now doing her PhD at UQ. Corinne, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
After that massive long introduction, thank you for being here. And yeah, look, I hear you've had a busy couple of days. You've just come from the University of Technology in Sydney?
Yeah, last night. An organisation called ATSE, ATSE for the Australian Academy for Technology and Engineering.
Okay, and that was for this event that we've got right here, the Resource Futures.
Yes, the University of Technology Sydney hosted it, and within that institute, they are proponents of the circular economy and gathering wealth from waste. So it's they're really looking at energy as well as mining related sustainability practices.
Right.
But ATSE produced a policy position action statement, and they are wanting to promote Australia, or want Australia to become a leader in the world in mine rehabilitation and closure. And it explores some of the limitations that we are currently facing and some of the problems, and particularly around reputation of the mining industry around mine rehab and closure.
Right. And
how that's affecting the industry, and wanting to bring in explore opportunities for more technology, but better practices, and ultimately to build trust in the mining sector, and also to sell our expertise overseas. So it's sort of to promote it.
Yeah, right. Look, quite a lot of challenges there ahead of them, but obviously they're looking for that circular, sustainable economy type of future for Australia's mining industry and all of our production industries as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, waste is a key issue associated with mining, and that sustainable. The Institute for Sustainable Futures looks at all types of waste, so they go beyond mining. This ATSE action statement is specifically focused on mining.
Yeah, right. I did see some interesting stuff in there about technological waste and all kinds of stuff. Yeah, fascinating stuff. It was a good meeting, obviously.
We had a panel discussion.
Right.
It involved state and federal government and a couple of experts in the waste sector and contaminated land, and how you can clean up and increase value of land through clean-up processes and so on, and just looking at new technologies. So it's a really diverse group, and I can't say I'm fully across all of these issues, but I was there to represent the rehab and closure space, and because I've done some research on abandoned mines, I've got a bit of a handle on what's happening in Australia versus overseas.
Right, and a lot of abandoned mines in Australia.
Oh, we've got a lot, but that's not so meaningful. It's really about, which ones are significant, and
and
it's really
what
about
can be done with them.
Yeah, and are they being managed? So it wouldn't matter so much if we had really well coordinated programs that were systematically working through those sites, but every state's doing its own thing. So,
okay, right.
Yeah, so some states are pulling together fairly organised programs and have a levy to fund it and so on, and others don't. So it's just a patchwork.
Right.
Is there an intent to create a national way of monitoring?
Yes, so that when they developed a national strategic framework in 2010 under COAG, that was, I thought, the intention to have some national implementation plan. But it just stopped in 2010, so the committee just disbanded and nothing happened. So it's a challenge with state-based responsibilities when the federal government, where and when and how should they get involved. And so abandoned mines clearly is, a bucket full of challenges. The federal government doesn't really want to buy into that. It's a state issue.
And they'd rather, not put their hands on that hot potato.
Okay, but at the same time, Australia likes to promote its mining ability. So the Australian government gets engaged when they want to write like a series of leading practice booklets. So they wrote a series of 14 booklets at the same time as they developed the strategic framework for abandoned mines. So those leading practice booklets looked at rehab closure, water management, community engagements, a whole range of things. And by pulling out good case studies, you can tell a coherent story about what is good practice or leading practice.
Right.
But the priority for Australia was really on that rather than abandoned mines. But at the same time, just since then, there's been much more interest in abandoned mines and mining legacies generally. And a Senate inquiry was commenced this year, so they're looking at mine rehabilitation to try and understand what the Australian government's responsibilities are with respect to that, particularly under the EPBC Act, 1999. So, does it relate to that, and what is their role in it? And so on.
Do they have any liability to act, kind of thing?
Yeah.
Well, hopefully it pushes them for some action because.
So that may head down a path where there's some national changes, but really, after studying abandoned mines, they fall into a regulatory black hole. They really don't belong anywhere. They sort of float about,
right?
And they can be ignored or they can be fixed up, depending on the will of the government or individuals. Sometimes you can have some really passionate individuals in a government department that powers ahead and gets a lot of support for it. But it's all sort of under the radar in a way that it's sitting outside of the normal regulatory process.
Yeah, right.
They just they either occurred when there was no legislation, or now that there's no owner, there's no way of regulating it.
Right, the whole mine ownership and land ownership becomes quite an issue.
If you've got a mining lease, the Environmental Protection Act in Queensland has a mechanism for regulating that site. But if it's not active and there's no owner, then it actually defaults to the state or the private landowner, depending on it's Crown land or freehold.
Wow.
And so
that already gets complicated.
Yeah, but at that point, the EP Act doesn't address it, but the Mineral Resources Act gives the power to the Mines Department to go in and do work on abandoned mines, which they can do, and they have done a lot of shaft capping in particular, to keep areas safe, like Gympie or Charters Towers.
Yeah.
But it just sits in the middle, and so the safety factors might be the focus, but the environmental aspects just get overlooked or they're undervalued. So it's very complex in that once it falls into a regulatory no man's land, who's going to pull it out? Really do governments want to pull it out of there and say put it on their contaminated land register if it's got contaminated land, because then they've got to fix it up. So.
And I guess it's easier to just cap holes than it is to actually restore a site and grow mature trees and a proper ecosystem. Yeah,
so that's one aspect of it. So if it's just disturbed land and you need to do revegetation, then you've got the usual challenges, particularly if there's no topsoil, and you might have acid materials or saline materials or just rocky materials, so just not good environment for vegetation. But the other aspect, which is harder to see, is around contamination. So on the one hand, it could just be the weathering of the rock that's been brought out during mining.
Yeah.
And it just weathers so rapidly that it yields, acid mine drainage or just low pH water,
Yeah.
metal-laden water, saline
Even
water.
here on the coast, there's a lot of sodic soils all over the place. Very,
Yeah, so that's a different, similar geochemical process, but different context.
Yeah,
Yeah. So you get acid sulfate soils in coastal areas, but but it is the same. You're exposing minerals to oxygen, and they rapidly weather and form sulfuric acid.
Wow, that's fascinating. So obviously, I know very little about geomorphology. So
Yeah, well,
talking about sodic
actually,
soils over
yeah.
acids.
So fill us in.
Well, geomorphology. That's
Yeah,
really
yeah, so
just
look,
about landforms and how landforms weather. So I always explain it like a geologist deals with hard rock, the rock in situ or the rocks themselves. But geomorphology is how they weather and form landscapes.
Right, so it's a bit more of a dynamic process.
Yeah,
of
so
geology.
around rivers and floodplains and how cliffs may. It's just the natural process of geomorphology is one part. The bit that I spent a fair bit of time on was applied geomorphology.
Okay.
So when we change the landscape, how do we restore some sort of stability to it?
Okay.
And geomorphology, because those weathering processes occur in long time periods, over thousands of years, millions of years, you're dealing with long term processes. So I guess when I went into mine rehabilitation initially, I came from a soil conservation background, having worked for the New South Wales government in soil conservation. So it was mainly to do with farmers, national parks, roadworks in national parks, just stabilising the soil so that you didn't have the soil washing off into the river and filling dams, reducing water quality.
Yeah, just changing hydrogeological patterns and everything,
upsetting the balance in the local river system, but also losing that valuable soil, which is so important for productivity.
Right.
So I was working in southern New South Wales and with sheep grazing or other sorts of agricultural practices. And so if you've lost your topsoil, you lose your productivity. So there was a really strong focus on keeping the soil where it belonged. And also where I first worked, it was in the catchment of Warragamba Dam. So it was, even though it was down near Goulburn, it was just in the southern part of the Warragamba catchment, and there was a subsidy for soil conservation works, which helped farmers to do the works, and that was my first job.
Oh, fantastic.
So from there, then to the Northern Territory with working in a mine. Yeah.
All right. And was there something that initially, I always like to talk about how people got involved. Was it, obviously for a lot of us wildlife people, there's some animal that we like to start chasing when we're young.
Yep.
Was there something, was there something about geology that got you, or earth sciences that kind of triggered your interest when you were?
It's interesting because when I was at school, I loved science and I loved geography.
Fantastic.
Physical geography.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know. You never know. You have fantastic teachers, or you love it, and so you do well, and then your teachers love you.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Well, I guess maybe you never got tired of looking at maps, very complicated
I
maps.
love maps.
There we go.
I'm a fan of maps. I used to get in a bit of trouble with my coloured pencils because my peers used to think I was just sucking up.
Oh, right.
But no, I used to love maps.
Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah.
All right, and so you came from a soil conservation background.
Yeah, that was my first job.
And was there some point specifically where you kind of went into mine rehab?
Yes, I went on a holiday, and I was up at Cape York. So I did this big road trip, and on the way back, I was doing my postgrad studies, and I had to do an exam, and I had to pick a town where I was going to do that exam on a particular date, and I chose Weipa. And
oh, wonderful, beautiful place.
Yeah, and the local reverend had to supervise my exam, and I was in the bottom of his house, and interestingly, the subject matter applied geomorphology was looking at dunes and beaches and coastal processes. So that's another aspect of this is coastal geomorphology, and we'd just been up through the desert and up to Cape York, and I was able to see the difference between tropical beaches and subtropical beaches and so on. And I was starting to it was like I was really living it. So I was reading and studying. When I did the exam, it was just, I don't know, the best exam ever. I was chilled, but I'd been reading and studied. I did really well in that subject, but I came back feeling like, this is what I got to study. But also went on a mine tour at Weipa, and so that was pretty exciting. We they had organised tours, and so it's a bauxite mine, so it's very shallow mining.
Yep.
It's a lot easier to get the revegetation going because the topsoil can be scraped off. The bauxite removed and the topsoil put back, and so it all happens in sequence. It's probably one of the easier mine types. It doesn't mean it's all done well everywhere, but if they get it right, it can be done very well. So we went on tour, and I just got really hooked on the whole process of how you bring life back to mined landscapes.
Yeah, right.
And this was at a time when they were experimenting with horticulture, so they had tropical fruit trees growing. So they had this massive like orchard, jackfruit and breadfruit and you name it. And I thought it was very peculiar, but at the same time it kind of got my interest.
Yeah, right. And they were growing all of those on the bauxite topsoil.
On the rehab areas, And they were trying to build a market and a new business, which I think was probably ahead of its time, but also difficult because of the distance to the markets. And so I think in the end that was what brought it undone, but at least they were willing to try it.
Yeah.
But I found all of that quite exciting, just the ability to bring things back.
That's very cool.
What do they do with the stockpiled topsoil?
So you put it aside until you need it, or you move it onto a new area. So if you've got mining in sequence, so there's this pre-stripping. So you before mining. So if there's a bauxite resource and you push the topsoil back and you start mining in a particular area, then you can bring the soil around and spread it over there. But as you go in sequence, you may be able to strip the topsoil from there and put it straight there.
Okay.
So the idea is if you don't, it's not a complete backfill in that the ground surface has been lowered. You do end up with like shallow pits or undulating pits, depending on the nature of the resource that's been removed. But direct scraping of topsoil and placement is best. That's the ideal because it's fresh, it's got all the living things in it.
Well, it still has all the local microbes that are there in the soil.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
And often a lot of seed, which saves money on re-veg costs if it's done well.
There's a massive seed bank in that soil from previous generations of plants that didn't germinate last season, ready to go.
Yeah, and that can be a negative thing if it's full of weeds, but it's good if it's good full of natives and mycorrhizal fungi as well. So fungi are really important, and they've been found to be increasingly important for mine rehab because you're often dealing with materials that don't have soils and biology, living things in it.
Right. So you've got to kind of restore the soil from the ground up before you can even think about the rest of it.
Yep. You've got to start with
healthy soil.
Yeah, but even below that, if you're working on another sort of mine, you've got waste rock, you've got to really understand the characteristics of that because some of those waste rocks types, if they've got the sulfide minerals, then they do need to be capped and sealed. You don't want water or oxygen getting in.
Things leaching through into the natural ecosystem.
Metalliferous mines are more often posed with those challenges. So whether they've got a tailings dam, which is the ground up residue from mineral processing, or waste rock, which is the sub-economic ores, so it's hasn't got enough in there to go through the mill. Right. So you've got these two lots of waste. The tailings, the residue, the mud goes to a dam often, and the waste rock is piled up into a new landform. Yeah. So really, when it comes to rehabilitation, you're really faced with these two types of waste and also a pit of some sort, a final void. Is it going to be a lake? Are you going to backfill it? Are you going to reshape it? Are you going to partially backfill it? Are you going to do a bit of both? Or are you going to co-dispose? Some pits you can put tailings and waste rock together and form quite a dense mass of material, and that's got advantages for strength, and it makes it stable. But anyway, there's a whole lot of
a lot of different methods,
different ways and different solutions for each waste.
Yeah, right. Wow. So that's a lot of different challenges. I guess that is a very challenging and interesting field to go into. And how long were you in it before you got the fellowship?
So I moved. So after the Cape York trip, and I just applied for the first mining job I saw, and it happened to be at Ranger Uranium Mine in the Northern Territory. So I got that, which was a big change from going from Cooma, where it was freezing cold, up to the tropics.
Yeah, but, lovely area.
Yeah, but I'd sort of been hooked on the tropics after the trip to Cape York. So, and living in Jabiru in Kakadu was just wonderful, and had 10 years there, and then I had about 7 years with the Queensland Government at Rockhampton before moving to Brisbane, and then I applied for Churchill Fellowship after that. So I'd been managing abandoned mines in Queensland by the time I applied for the Churchill Fellowship, because I was at that point where I said, right, well, we know what we're doing here at this one site, but as a state, and other sites were, some of them had some activity happening, but I was concerned about the stop-start nature of how we were managing abandoned mines, and I thought, how do countries overseas deal with this? How do they follow through? How do they develop the programs? How do they resource them? So there's continuity. Before that, I hadn't really fully appreciated the regulatory absence around it in Australia. So that was something I learned about, but also accounting for liabilities. We don't account for the liabilities here, whereas overseas in Canada they do. And so there were things like that I learned. So it wasn't the grassroots stuff. It wasn't sort of how they revegetated. It was with their water treatment plants. Some of them had public-private partnerships to fund water treatment plants. So in Canada, in British Columbia, they had one at an old metal mine, Britannia mine, near the harbour. So they how they funded them and how they ran them and how they...
Kind of on an economic scale.
Yeah, it was it's a very cross-disciplinary, and so clearly I'm not an expert in all those fields, but I was trying to look at how governments led, how they really were proactive, how they responded, how audits were undertaken. The Auditor General would undertake an audit and say, you've got to do this. Then suddenly programs were transformed. And because I could read the auditor's report for British Columbia Crown Contaminated Sites Program as an example, and I'd read it and I'd go, oh, they're all the problems we've got here.
And they resolved them eventually, or some
of
them.
Yeah, no, they did. They immediately, like within 12 months, made some of the changes, which then led to all the other changes being implemented.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah.
So some pretty important lessons there that we could take.
Yeah.
So that's fascinating. You went to Austria, Germany, England, and Canada to learn about how they're, managing their challenges in mine rehab. Obviously, they probably have some pretty different issues in such densely populated regions of the world, particularly compared to Australia.
Yes, but also I should point out I was looking at different programs as well as and different scales. So I did look at some local projects, but also some regional scale projects. So in East Germany, after reunification of Germany, when the West basically took over East Germany, you had a whole region of mines abandoned. So these mines were operating without care for the environment, so they were operated very cheaply. But as soon as they become part of the unified Germany, they had to raise their standards.
Right.
And so that's why they were uneconomic. So whole towns disappeared. It was major, social disruption, but because of those political changes. But at the same time, it was an opportunity for really the expertise of the West to be applied in these degraded landscapes. So, for example, the old brown coal mining area of East Germany, which is south of Berlin and north of Leipzig, close to the Polish border.
Leipzig still has some pretty big lignite mining.
There are a few there, but the main lignite mines in Germany are more towards Cologne, in the west.
Of course, yeah.
But this area still does have some, but something like 80% closed in that time. So they're left with all these pits and no communities, or virtually no communities.
Yeah.
Significant socio-economic impact as well as environmental. So they initiated two significant projects. One had a landscape architecture focus on how we're going to make this beautiful again, this ugly landscape, how are we going to make it beautiful, but also how are we going to bring people back.
Yeah.
So how are we going to provide employment. And then the other group, which they probably, from the outside, you don't see as much of, but fundamentally important for making sure that the pits were stable as they restored them back into pit lakes. So they've developed a series of pit lakes, and because they're sort of soft sediments, those sides could collapse in. There was this engineering group which was established to manage the filling of the pits and also the water treatment, because the water was acid as well.
Right.
So they had to lime dose it and treat it as it filled, so that the objectives of the project to have recreation lakes, have people using these lakes and interacting, and having foreshores developed to make it easily accessible, having canals to connect different lakes so people can take their boat from one to the other.
Wow.
And lookouts and bike trails and rollerblading paths and you name it, and they reinstated that and then built motels, hotels, and then started selling off the land around the foreshores. So then they were starting to recoup the costs. So it started as a massive liability and it ends up as a massive asset. And
Fantastic.
This is really something you've got to have a long-term plan about.
Yeah.
But knowing that they've done it, we can learn from that.
Were you seeing kind of the tail end of that process? Or?
I saw it 10 years into the, so EBA-C was the name of the landscape architect project, and the LMBV was the acronym for the engineering company. And so this landscape architect project was 10 years, and they were celebrating the 10 years with a conference, and that was a conference that I went
Fantastic.
to in 2009. So it only started in, only 10 years prior. So it took a number of years for them, I guess, to conceive what they were going to do with that area. And then once they started it, then they had distinct programs with predetermined endpoints. Like I said, this is what we've got to achieve. And that's when they engaged universities. Cottbus University, which is not far away, were very active in the landscape architecture area. So it had a really high intellectual component, as well as the nuts and bolts of the work and engineering and science. So there's a lot of money invested, but they knew that once they brought that region back, it would be of socio-economic benefit for the whole country.
That's fascinating, especially the thing about the sides of the pits. It's not a lake that's formed by natural hydrogeological processes, so it's a lot steeper. It doesn't have as much, I guess, vegetation and riparian stuff stopping erosion.
Nothing.
So it's just ready to.
They were all dry pits, until then, because they were actively dewatering.
And fairly steeply cut as well.
Yeah,
so,
and in soft sediments, which they didn't exactly know how they'd behave as they started to fill with water.
Right.
So, and they did have major failures before they realised exactly what was going on. So there was a lot of information gathering, but we've learned a lot from them as well, because individuals have come and presented at conferences, and so we can learn from that.
Fascinating. Very interesting. All right, I guess we should talk a bit about global mining and global land use around the world. According to the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, mining activities are the planet's third biggest cause of deforestation. Just a quote here: oil, gas and mineral extraction account for an estimated 7% of global deforestation in the subtropics, with increasing exploration and development taking place. In more affluent countries, oil, gas, coal and mineral developments continue to degrade and pose threats to forests, such as in the Canadian boreal and the Russian taiga, where oil transportation and infrastructure is being planned and developed. So obviously that's a lot of impacts on wildlife that's going to be potentially happening from all of this stuff. Habitat destruction, changes in hydrogeology. You're mentioning a lot about the, contamination, toxic contamination effects, which can be there, and, natural issues with climate change. I guess as far as I understand it, there's three main strategies that are kind of employed to mitigate the mining impacts of biodiversity. So prior, you're taking some strategic assessments to kind of look at the impact caused by regional developments. Offsets, during, and, of course, supporting regional conservation activities, and then the rehabilitation during closure, aiming for self-sustaining ecosystems that interact positively with the surrounding landscape. Is that about right? Yeah?
Yes, so on the biodiversity, because I am a geomorphologist, I don't consider myself an ecologist or
of course.
an expert in those areas, but as you were reading that, I was just thinking about the relatively small footprint of mining compared with grazing and other areas. That doesn't mean that there's not a lot of impact in that space. It's just sort of, I was just trying to, I don't know much about those global figures, and I know less about the.
It did seem quite high to me. Yeah, I do know that agricultural deforestation is probably the main cause of and here in Queensland, we're going to be losing 1 million hectares planned for clearing next year, and the majority of very little of that is actually through mining and resources. The majority is through agriculture.
I guess that makes me think, what is, in your opinion, is the priority sites for a rehabilitation?
You mean from active mines or abandoned mines,
or both,
everything?
Really?
Yeah. So I actually see water as being at the heart of it. I see land rehabilitation as absolutely fundamentally important, but if you don't get the geochemistry aspects right, you can't do that. So I think that understanding of geochemistry, what's going on in the landscape, you've got to stabilise it, contain it, do something with that to make it stable before you revegetate. So more often than not, I see that as the major obstacle. So there was an interesting study by David Lawrence at the University of New South Wales. It was about 10 years ago, and he studied 800 mine closures in Australia over 2 decades. And he found that 75% of mines closed earlier than planned. So 25% were going through their resource and finishing the resource as they'd planned, and the rest were stopping prematurely. And he looked at the reasons why. So whether there was like a safety incident or flooding underground, or even an underground operation that had come to an end, which then made the open cut operation unviable, whatever it was. There was a whole series of environmental incidents. Could have been extreme weather events, filled up pits with water, they couldn't, it then made it unviable, whatever. But the important thing about that information was really that it's actually less likely that you'll go to plan than you'll go to plan. The mining operation. So that was the thing that struck me, that you often see mines saying, oh, we weren't quite ready to close, so we haven't got the closure plan, or we didn't think this would happen, or we were setting aside these wastes or those soils to cover this, and now we can't get at that because we're not going to keep mining in that area. So understanding right from the outset the characteristics of the waste is as important as understanding the resource. And this is something that hasn't been well appreciated in legislation or in practice until perhaps the 90s, getting into the 2000s, but even then not consistent, across all jurisdictions. So, but most big mining companies understand it and know that this has to be done, but it's really, I hear often from geochemists, just not enough samples taken early on about the waste so you understand the waste. Because that's what's going to stay there forever. The ore's going. So from an environmental perspective, from a rehab perspective, the waste, you've got to understand the characteristics. And if you know that really well from the start, you can place them in much better places. So if you put the really highly reactive waste in a particular repository and then encapsulate it with the less reactive or even neutralising materials, then you can build up a dump that's much more stable. So these are the challenges of making sure our water resources aren't impacted.
Yeah, and I suppose if they know what those things are, then they can plan for contingencies if something does go wrong.
If it's really well characterised, then you can adapt it along the way. And you can always do more sampling as you go along, but the actual mine design from the start, getting that right. And it is typical for mines to start with a plan and then extend and add on, and because that's just, you've got to get the capital, get started, bring the income, and then extend the mine and so on. So they'll often go ahead in stages, just like tailings dams will go up in lifts. You'll start with a dam, be depositing in there, and then put in another lift and another lift, and that adapts that structure for the life of the project. But there's a lot of talk now, particularly just last week, UNEP, the United Nations Environment Programme, brought out a document about tailings themselves, saying we've got to get away from having tailings dams that can fail. So after Samarco in South America, where high moisture content tailings just flow down the river in the tailings dam structure when the dam failed. There's a number of examples of how this occurs, but really they were pushing for zero deaths. So they want 100% safety. So I mean that's always hard to achieve, but that's what their goal was in this paper, by describing how tailings dams are built, what are the problems and the flaws, and how do these failures occur. So one of the key things is thickening the tailings so that they're so thick and strong they just can't flow. So you just extract that water. So it costs more, but if you do it during the life of an operation, then you don't have this huge risk. Similarly, it's easier to rehabilitate at the end. So one of the hardest things, I think, if you're looking at looking at a mine from a closure perspective, from the start, you'd be designing all these things in. But it means bringing forward some of that expenditure that you're otherwise thinking you don't need to spend till the end.
Into researching and planning the waste.
And planning it and depositing it well, and building a very stable containment facility right from the start. And I think that's where we could do a lot more research around the value of that, because one of the fundamental challenges with how we model financial aspects of mines is the discounted cash flow, which means that any expenditure in the future is diminished in that process. So you could have $100 million liability for closure, put it away there in the future, but it's only maybe 20 million now, if you know what I mean, in an accounting sense. So discounted cash flow encourages us to downplay those risks at closure, if that's how it's been assigned, if those costs and those liabilities have been put to the end of the operation. But if you bring it to the present and actually embed it in design, the whole idea is that you don't actually have that liability then, but it works against the principles of of net present value of money.
Right.
So that's just one aspect that's been highlighted along the way. It's not encouraging progressive rehab. So the other thing is they've finished an area of waste dump, each year in stages. So it's a coal mine and there's a spoil pile. They can shape it up and revegetate it and move it along. But the incentive to do that work is not there when they can defer expenditure and put it off and put it off. And so this is where Queensland Treasury have now become involved in looking at the financial assurance system and the incentives for rehab and wanting to encourage better progressive rehabilitation at mines, because a lot of mines are deferring the rehabilitation, and that was picked up by Lock the Gate in one of their reports on mine rehabilitation, and also the Auditor General did an audit in 2014 that said some of these environmental issues aren't being addressed well. So,
well, it's interesting if they can, just a little bit of, I guess, a little bit more expenditure at the start can really decrease some of those impacts. I mean, that'd be
right
fantastic.
expertise.
I mean, there is a growing demand for minerals and a higher mineral prices, but at the same time, there's that downturn in fossil fuels that's currently going on. I guess I wonder if we're going to be seeing an increase or decrease in overall mining impacts with as those things hopefully, applied.
Yeah, it's a good question. I know there's a big push for really deep mining that, you have less disturbance at the surface. So if you have, and I think that the really, really deep mining, so we already have underground mining, but what they're talking about, not being a mining engineer, I'm not familiar with it, but it's about extracting resources with very little footprint of disturbance.
Right, getting so far below them into the mantle that
Well, I don't know, but also getting minerals that have been previously inaccessible by open cut measures or underground measures that we currently do with the distance that we go down now with the equipment that we've got. So it's probably about new technology. And
that's interesting that if you go deeper, you maybe do less damage rather than staying and messing around in some of these open cut pits and that kind of stuff.
Well, it's
subsidence is an issue, but I guess you can backfill a lot of that stuff too.
Oh, well, no. Well, subsidence is a very serious issue. And there again, New South Wales has got a subsidence board, or they used to have one. I'm not sure if it still exists, but the idea, particularly around Newcastle, Hunter Valley, was to have an independent agency. I think there was a levy paid by the companies, and then the Mine Subsidence Board would deal with complaints. So if someone said, we've got a crack in our house or whatever, they'd investigate it. And so based on engineering and science, they would determine, yes, that's related to that mine or whatever.
Yeah.
And they would fund the repairs of the house. Or the highway, the main highway going north, if it had a crack or somewhere near Newcastle, they would fix it. So that situation is quite unique in Australia. You would think that everyone would have one because it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So Queensland doesn't, and so we have problems at Ipswich and
with subsidence.
Collingwood Park in particular. Yeah. Collingwood Park is it's been described in an audit report that they did in 2012 here in Queensland when the LNP government came in. They did a commission of audit to look at all the liabilities and assets and things. So in there they mentioned Collingwood Park specifically, as well as the other abandoned mines in Queensland, and estimated the total liability as being $1 billion. And the Collingwood Park was in its own little category because it's in suburban areas, in perhaps more high value land because it's in urban areas, and also with greater safety risk. I think they relocated people in that area, but whole houses were sinking into the ground. So I think it was quite close to the surface.
And that's Collingwood Park. That's what, half an hour drive from here?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with it in a lot of detail, but I know that that's where subsidence has its greatest impacts. And I think there was a lot of drilling that went into the freeway and the upgrade to make sure that there was, because the area's got a lot of mines in it.
Yeah.
So the records aren't all that great. It's a real important lesson for the value of keeping good records. So governments have to keep those records, like no one else is going to keep them. So governments have to prioritise the keeping of all these records of where mines have been and what they've been doing there and what are the activities, because in the future some areas that are in the middle of nowhere now might have a town on them. So we've really got to be much better at keeping records, three-dimensional GIS.
Interesting what you were saying about Germany and how they that there were entire towns abandoned. I mean, with a lot less land to work with, there'd probably be more need to rehabilitate simply because you've got to put people somewhere. Do you find that mines closer to urban areas receive more attention here in Australia?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure of that.
Yeah.
Certainly when it comes to abandoned mines.
Yeah.
In the floods inquiry, they looked at Mount Oxide, which is up north of Mount Isa. Like they didn't actually visit the site, but they had a witness come forward with a statement about acid mine drainage from that mine, and the water's bright blue coming from this acid mine drainage, and it was affecting their creek and the cattle that couldn't drink the water for a while. But anyway, and it dries out. It's an intermittent creek, but there's been virtually no activity in terms of rehabilitation of that site because it's got an expiration lease on it, so another company may develop it. So there's always this tension between governments wanting to make
Pass
sure
it
that
on.
wanting another mine to come and solve all the problems.
Yeah, right.
So if you mine it, then we don't have to worry about it.
Yeah.
But in doing so, the company has to weigh up these existing liabilities with the future value and what they want to take on or not. And so there is some legislation overseas. There's the Good Samaritan legislation, which helps to separate out liabilities from historic and present. So it does enable some new mines to start in areas that were mined before without the new owner inheriting all of the liability. So if in that process of trying to bring value back to some of these lands and provide more employment, there will be examples where the government will need to say, right, you're not responsible for that, you're only responsible for that. And they've got to carve up those liabilities.
Right.
Because a lot of those liabilities occurred before there was legislation. Like, it's no one to point the finger at.
Yeah.
It's different now, if someone abandons a mine now, or even
well, if you keep good records, it is.
on sells it, for $1 or something, which we saw a little bit of a few years back, or perhaps more recently than that. Just changing hands for not very much money. It just raises a lot of questions about liability.
That's interesting.
Political will and funding seems to be the two main challenges that pop up again and again. How have you seen that change over the time that you've been working in it?
So I think public awareness of the issue is the key change, because it's like for a very long time the relationship between governments and industry to develop the resources has been a fairly closed one. And I think as time's gone on, the communities want to have a greater say in those resources, not only in approvals for where the mine's going to go and how they're going to mine and dust and all those activities that impact or affect communities while they're mining. But now part of that discussion is more about rehab and closure, how you're going to leave it. And it's just taken us a while, I think, for that endpoint as a society, I think, for that endpoint to become real.
Yeah, right.
So, when you start a mine, it's a long way off. Don't worry about that. And the communities too, they're happy to have the jobs. They can see the benefits. They might have got another town doctor, or new shops opened up, or they've got these extra facilities. But at a regional scale, the governments have to also manage the downturn and the redeployment, the loss of employment. Transition to new land uses. It could be transitioning from a mining operation to another business on that parcel of land. But the legislation really is lagging well behind. It really still just deals with, I'll say weeds and seeds, but it does sort of sound a bit insulting to the re-veg side of the job. But if that's all they're addressing, they're not going quite far enough, because, yes, that's you've got to sort that out, make sure it's stable, non-polluting and safe. But then you've got to look at the values. What value is that parcel of land to someone? So Muswellbrook Council is an example in the Hunter Valley, the Upper Hunter, where the council wants to have a much greater say about the land use. They also wanted to get access. There was a conference down there in March this year that I went to. And it was very interesting because the mayor, Martin Rush, was talking about how he'd love to get access to the buffer lands on the mines. So the mines can have a big parcel of land, but they may only need that much to mine. But they have buffer lands to make sure that no one necessarily builds too close and then ends up being impacted by dust or noise, and it becomes a problem. So you do need these buffers. But the council were basically saying that within their shire, they had half of the area as national park and a quarter was mining, and they only had the other quarter to work with in terms of building any new industry or employment opportunities. So they were wanting to have access to some of these buffer lands and just have more of a say there. Yeah, so this is really an example where local government doesn't have much of a say about mines, where they go, how long they go, how they leave their site, but they're wanting to have a say because they are, in that case, surrounded by mines.
Yeah.
So I think 3 coal mines on all sides, and in the distance from you can see them in town. But so I actually think what's shifting is public awareness, and perhaps public proximity in some cases where there's more people. Hunter Valley certainly has got a lot more activity, and you hear a lot more about it because there's people from Sydney going up to the wineries. There's horse breeding,
and so you do get to see those impacts as well on the way
and the
through.
thoroughbred breeders are well equipped, and they've been fighting cases in court, so they're resourced, so they're a very active group. But you look in Queensland, the Bowen Basin or Galilee Basin, or even Surat or Ipswich basins.
There's not exactly a lot of communities out there to find that.
But there's still
plenty
interaction.
Of
yeah. But so I don't know what. Does that answer the question?
No, it does.
Yeah.
Oh, fascinating stuff. Look, I do want to maybe kind of walk the audience through just the basics of mine rehab while we got you here. I've been through a few in my time in fauna management and this kind of stuff. I've seen some pretty big coal mines and stuff, and I've seen some that there's already some pretty big areas set off for rehab that they're getting to work on, but the scale of things is pretty massive once you're actually on the ground. So look, could you walk us through, like, let's say an open cut coal mine producing like 5 to 10 million tons of coal per annum for 20 years. Where do you start with rehabilitating that? If that's being closed after 20 years, they've got basically no more resources in the ground.
Yeah, so normally with the coal mines, they'd be building the spoil piles parallel to the open cut part of it, sort of placing it behind and then sort of going across the landscape.
Moving along,
Yeah, but then you'll end up with a large rectangular or shaped void at the end that's going to be a pit lake.
Right.
So that casting of the spoil behind enables, like if it's left unshaped, you end up with these zigzaggy type topography, these parallel piles from the dragline, so the dragline operations.
So that all gets recontoured and stabilised.
It is possible to see, if you look at aerial photography or satellite imagery, to see in some cases where they've been doing it systematically that those older ones have been smoothed off and shaped, and you might have water bodies built into them and drainage systems and so on. And then as you get closer to the mine, you get back to the sort of the raw spoil pile. So you have this transition. Like when I see that, I always think, oh, that's a nicely planned mine. You can see it happening.
Okay.
And then sometimes you can see the whole shebang and nothing's happening.
Yeah. Okay.
What's going on there?
Yeah, they haven't even started.
No. And one of the reasons was that a lot of the mines, I shouldn't say a lot, maybe 10, around 8 to 10 anyway, were covered by special agreement acts. They had their own legislation, and this I think goes back to the Bjelke-Petersen era,
right,
where the push was on getting mines started and having employment and just go ahead and do it, but don't worry about the rehab.
Yeah.
Now, I don't think that was the wisest decision
I think
to be
we can all
made,
agree
because
on that.
a lot of, as I say, those really important decisions made early make a big difference later on, particularly around topsoil. So if all the topsoil got buried and you've just got this spoil that's sodic or dispersible and pretty much barren and inhospitable, then you've got a much harder job to rehabilitate.
Right.
So in the last... I can't even think when it was, maybe 10 years ago, roughly, they started to transition those mines across to a modern environmental authority. So to get rid of the State Agreement Act, Special Agreement Act that they had.
Right.
And they've done that now. But if you look at those mines, I think Collinsville was one, maybe Callide. I can't remember now, but they're online, you can look them up. But and even Weeper, I think, was one. So there's... and Mount Isa and a few others. Anyway, they had special agreement acts which enabled them to be exempt.
Right.
And so in the process of transitioning across, that's when I think a lot of the challenges are being realised. Oh, that's hard.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So you've got your waste dumps.
Oh, yeah. So the waste dumps, if they're going along. So you also got river diversions.
Yeah.
So these big box cuts sort of cut across the landscape in a way that...
Just change the hydrogeology.
Yeah, you might have rivers that were going like that, and now you have to steer them around quite often permanently.
Wow.
So these there's been a lot of research on them, but the challenge with with river diversions is that it's very hard to create a natural river shape. So a lot of fluvial geomorphology, getting into another area, geomorphology, and riparian veg and all that reinstatement. So trying to create natural, and sometimes I think the early ones probably just look like engineered channels, and as time's gone on, they've probably put a bit more effort into making them more natural. But that is an area where ACARP research comes in. So there's a coal levy, and that funds research under ACARP, which is the Coal Association Research Program. So that's been probably a good thing for the coal sector for Australia, whereas other mining industries don't have that same setup.
Right.
It's probably quite sensible to have a levy and a research body, and then have industry people on those committees saying this is what we want studied. So it's where 4 or 5 mining companies or less say we want to study that. It's doing it together instead of all having to do it separately, so that the principles from that can be applied more widely.
Interesting.
Yeah.
All right. So look, on top of that, you've got your open pit basically.
Yeah.
And tailings dams as well that still need to be dealt with.
Yeah. So for coal mines, they're called washery wastes rather than tailings, because they wash the coal to get soil and other stuff out of them, and so you end up with these.
Tailings is more for other minerals.
Well, tailings is involves grinding.
Okay.
So you've ground up your ore, and you've separated out the ore from the waste, and that slurry, it's like a mud. But washery waste is like a mud, but you can have coarse and fine, and with the coarse waste, sometimes they're put in a different dump to the fines, and they're quite difficult to rehabilitate because of their water content. They're going to drain for a long time, and they're not very strong. So if you want to cover them, it's very hard to get doses on them and everything. So co-disposal is recommended in a lot of geotechnical engineering sort of space. They recommend co-disposal, so you get the fines of the coarse and you get a much more dense mass. Right. So it's kind of like marbles and sand and clay, so once
rather than just a slurry sitting there trying to evaporate.
And it just doesn't. They're just sloppy and hard to cover, and then they'll just sort of drain slowly over time. So you have this less than ideal water coming out, maybe saline water, and then the coarse material unable to do much with that either. So if they're going back into a pit, I think up at Tarong Coal, they'll put them back in a pit. You can put them in together, and it maximise the density. Okay. So if you have to build a dam to put this stuff in, you want high density because it costs money to raise it. Your dam's up, so the denser the material, the better. So there is that's again that forward planning for closure should be encouraging that, getting those wastes as dense as possible and stable physically, and excluding oxygen and water, and in the end having to cap and cover and grow stuff and then revegetate. Yeah,
eventually. And how long does something like that take to achieve? Have you seen a lot of successful mine rehabs with actual vegetation and ecosystem?
I have seen, yes, but patches, and areas where they've tried to connect with remnant vegetation through.
Right. I mean, it does take a long time for those things to grow back. I mean, even brigalow, which grows back pretty quickly, it's like 30 years until maturity.
Yeah, I think. The biggest challenge I think is if they don't start early, then they can't prove they can do it, and that's really the challenge. So unless mining companies start early, get it established, and then have that sequence where you can see the old to the young, right? And you can look at it like, I still think back to like Gove in the Northern Territory, which was bauxite. But you could, as you flew in or flew out, you just see this beautiful transition from the really mature 30 plus years old rehab, which you couldn't tell was rehab. It was done so well because it was the same guy who was there for 35 years. That's one of the other challenges with rehab, is getting that the local knowledge and knowing your soil, knowing your material, and having a degree of control over the mine department. And so he did have that degree of control. Like he'd say, no, get that topsoil out there now, or whatever it is. On him. So he was a German agricultural scientist, Dieter Hinz, and he did all this great stuff.
No worries, that's fantastic. Is there? I guess I want to know, how much incentive is there for mining companies to do that these days, to really?
So there's the reputation, which is a kind of a less tangible aspect.
The legislative one is probably...
The legislative one is, so financial assurance is one aspect. I always see it as being multifaceted. It's not just one solution. Yeah. And when you read the literature on it, it does seem like there's a number of factors, but the economists would argue that you need the economic drivers for it to happen, and it makes a lot of sense. That it has to be the right balance for the decision makers, to say we're going to do this work this year because there is that incentive. So then that comes back to your financial assurance or your bond, or every state calls it something different, but the way the government sets aside funding for that site to be rehabilitated should it close prematurely. It's important to note that quite often legislation addresses rehabilitation, the vegetation aspects, but maybe not all aspects of closure. So that might have a nominal amount for decommissioning or whatever, but sometimes there are a lot of gaps in there anyway. So if a mine does close prematurely, there often isn't a closure plan. There may not be a closure plan. Some may have one, but that's a challenge in itself. If you don't have the plan already done and you haven't done all the studies, you've got to stop for 3 or 5 years, whatever, to do all those studies and then do the work. So sometimes that's not factored into the financial assurance. So that is the system. They have a spreadsheet, an Excel spreadsheet the government issues. It's on their website, the Department of Environment and Heritage Protection. That spreadsheet is issued, or a series of sheets. You can click on it and say you're a coal mine or metalliferous mine or whatever, and it'll take you to specific prompts, and then companies fill it out to work out their financial assurance. I think they're allowed to use their own calculator tool under certain circumstances, but I'm not sure about that now. Because it's different in each jurisdiction.
Yeah, of course.
But
state by state.
Yeah, so that brings them up with a number, and then that's the amount they need to get a bank guarantee for. And that the purpose of that guarantee is that if the company goes into liquidation, that the government can access those funds, that they are sort of quarantined, and they can get them and then do the work.
Okay. Fascinating. Look, we've got so much more that we could talk about on this. We haven't even reached abandoned mines and rehab prospects, but I think we're going to have to have a little break and then get on to our new research segment. Okay, guys, we'll be back very shortly, and we'll be talking new research in just a minute. Okay, welcome back. We're on to our new research segment here. Normally we kind of split it up a little bit between local and then international, but this is kind of just going to go all over the shop. See how much time we have left on the clock. Not too much. Let's get straight into it. So starting with Hirth et al. 2017, whole organism concentration ratios in wildlife inhabiting Australian uranium mining environments, from the Journal of Environmental Radioactivity, available online 27th of April. So basically, in the natural process of an environmental impact assessment for naturally occurring radioactive mineral mining, for example uranium, companies need to evaluate wildlife radiation doses. This is done generally measuring whole organism concentration ratios, a value called CRWO media, which relates radionuclide activity concentrations of the whole organism to its environment. So that's whole organism, WO, to environment, media. These are collated at the International Atomic Agency's Wildlife Transfer Database at wildlifetransferdatabase.org. Pre-2013, not a lot of Australian records, a lot of underrepresented categories, for example, reptiles, and a focus on tissue uranium counts in meats and things for human consumption, which is then upscaled to the whole organism. So look, the aim for the authors here was to develop a comprehensive data set of CRWO media, that's the transfer ratios, values for wildlife in Australian uranium mining environments in arid and tropical areas. They wanted to test the difference between Australian and non-Australian, that's temperate dominated data within the wildlife transfer database, and improve the completeness of existing wildlife transfer data categories and identify some gaps. So, on to methods. They collected these values for CRWO media from mining operations, government agencies, exploratory surveys, journals, and straight up site investigations. So, often you're taking a small amount of tissue and then upscaling it to the whole organism. This was across terrestrial and freshwater eco groupings. And Australian values were compared with non-Australian values from the 2013 Wildlife Transfer Database summary tables using non-parametric Mann-Whitney U-tests, two-tailed at p-values 0.01 and 0.05. Pretty interesting stuff. They had these 5 terrestrial groups, grasses, shrubs, trees, reptiles, mammals, and 6 freshwater groups, for which they produced 271 new or revised transfer values for radium, lead, polonium, thorium, and uranium. The majority of these values are all submitted to the transfer database for people to compare in the future. There was an acidic tailings retention site that was excluded based on being a bit of an outlier, likely due to airborne radioactive dust activity. So for example, thorium was up at 8 times of what it was in some of the other sites or some of the other tests. I guess when you've got one of those acidic tailings sites, it produces more dust, which the reptiles and mammals then ingest or inhale. Is that due to the acidic nature? Is that something that happens in geomorphology if you've got a acidic tailings retention site?
If you've got nothing growing on your tailings, so whether it's saline or acid or alkaline, that's a problem. But also tailings dams can be in active use, so it depends where it is. So in like if you're in Kalgoorlie and it's very dry,
and it dries out.
The tailings dams, dry out in form of salty crust or whatever. Then there's dust issues, but it does depend on. There's every site's different. I'm not a expert in these aspects.
Right. Obviously, this is an outlier, so it's not something that they included in the wildlife transfer database. Just as a note, can
I just ask a question? Who uses the transfer database? What's it
is it? I guess it's used in those environmental impact assessments for companies and people looking to do naturally occurring resource mining, radioactive material mining, I guess the Atomic Energy Agency's subsidiaries around the world.
Yeah, so it's like just a data set, like a reference.
Yeah, exactly.
Set.
It's a big reference set for the ratios of media to the local organisms. So you can probably use that as a baseline to see if things are a bit higher or lower.
I think it's
it's an interesting value anyway. I guess it is meant to be that baseline that you can then compare things to. I guess that's the idea. Interesting. The tailings retention site has a higher concentration ratio from a higher rate of radionuclide transfer from media to the whole organism than the Taranaki nuclear test site in South Australia, where they used to test nuclear weapons. So they had quite a high rate there from that tailings retention site. Obviously, it's an outlier. Marsupial metabolic rates there's a bit of an issue there. They're about 70% that of what mammals are. So some of these, when they're upscaling these values to whole organism, there may be some issues there as well. The main I guess criticism that I have here is they've got Varanus panoptes, the yellow spotted monitor in here is listed as an aquatic species. So it may have a slightly higher aquatic diet and live closer to wetlands, but from one reference, which is actually looking at food items, indigenous food items from specifically the Magella and Cooper Creek areas. So of course you're going to have a higher amount of aquatic food in their diet than compared to other goannas. It's meant to be 30% more aquatic than eating 30% more aquatic food than the sand goanna, which is entirely terrestrial in habitat. Now, the yellow spotted monitor, according to if we take the Harold Cogger reptile book, is a large ground-dwelling monitor feeding largely on insects and terrestrial vertebrates. So it is pretty much a terrestrial animal. It's also known as the Argus monitor because it does occur around some wetlands a bit more than the sand goanna does, but it occurs all the way through to central Queensland and some very, very arid areas. I guess I'm a bit dubious on listing that as an aquatic organism. They actually did the same thing as well. They changed it to a soil-based media just so they could compare it to Varanus gourdii. just so they could do that comparison, despite the dietary difference. And they find that, the sand goanna, Gouldii, has up to 3 times higher ratios, but they only have a sample size of 1. So obviously a few issues here. No concentration ratios for marine organisms, phytoplankton, zooplankton, insects and larvae, amphibians, annelids, ferns, fungi, lichens or bryophytes.
One of the challenges that I have with this study, and I'm not, obviously haven't read the whole thing, but is that uranium up in the Alligator Rivers region of the Northern Territory outcrops in different locations, and so it's been there for millions of years.
Right.
So when you've got a mine there, obviously there's a concentration of activity and exposure of materials.
But there's going to be natural transfer anyway from the...
Well, I don't know about, I just remember from the aquatic studies, so this is not what we're talking about here, but the aquatic studies are just saying that the ecosystems were quite used to elevated uranium in the waters.
Yeah.
Like it wasn't a problem, it wasn't for toxicity. But it was the salinity that was a really key issue, and it was magnesium sulfate was actually the toxic element. So when they did aquatic, so this is getting away from this study, but when they're doing toxicity testing on cladostridine and hydra, back then when they're developing the water quality objectives,
The salinity seemed to be
magnesium sulfate was what the organisms in the aquatic environments were most sensitive to.
Interesting.
So because uranium outcrops, I think it's to do with the fact that you've got elevated uranium upstream, downstream, like before the mine was there, if you know what I mean. And so when a study like this is done, I wonder about mobility of animals there. I'm getting out of my depth, I'm not a fauna expert, but I think they're all over the place. Okay, so how do you know where they've been eating, what they're doing, where they're moving?
I think they're making some pretty serious assumptions about their ecology.
Yeah, anyway, I just questions that came to mind, but and that was only from learning from the biologist who used to do the tox testing, and was just, I remember they were shared the lab with me, and so over lunch you'd be talking about stuff, and but it was more the aquatic aspects.
Interesting. Globally, if we compare the data for the Australian transfer data, Australian about 83% of them fall above the regression line. So grasses and mammals significantly, shrubs not. Basically, there seems to be a bit of a higher transfer rate for whatever reason, whether that's the slower transfer rate, whether that's the slower metabolism of marsupials that we were talking about. Either way, it does appear that there needs to be a specific Australian-specific transfer data, and that understanding of local ecology is so important. Right? You completely, potentially misrepresented one of a monitor that you find across some very, very arid areas of Australia as being an aquatic organism. And I just wonder what kind of impacts that's going to have for comparison if for people looking at that naively and going, Varanus pinopter's aquatic organism. I guess we can compare it to other aquatic organisms.
Are they researchers based in the Northern Territory or somewhere else?
I am
don't know.
Not sure.
No,
we
no
have
worries.
the paper right here. We can have a look.
Okay.
Perth et al.
With an N value of
Victoria,
1, which was published.
New South Wales. We do have somebody in the Northern Territory there.
No, it's just interesting.
And somebody in the UK. So we got Victoria, New South Wales, Northern Territory, and the UK. Interesting. Thoughts, Mr. Adrian?
The fact that there was only one to compare is I'm surprised that it got published. It's not a
it is a bit of an outlier
not
there,
a good
but
data set.
no, it's not really. But I mean, like the whole 271 new or revised whole organism concentration ratios. That's fantastic. But that's that Gouldii comparison with one, and Anyway, otherwise not too bad. Moving on. Next paper. What do you guys think? I think we're going to go straight to this Kujala et al. Kujala? If it's anything like my name, it's Kujala et al. 2015. Towards strategic offsetting of biodiversity loss using spatial prioritization concepts and tools. A case study on mining impacts in Australia. This is from Biological Conservation 192. Very interesting. So offsetting is very widely used in a lot of this land use planning. So you basically got a couple of ideas: either protect or restore degraded habitat if you've done some damage. Typically done using a like-for-like approach. So, for example, if you have 1 hectare of a specific vegetation type destroyed, you have to offset with 1 hectare of the same vegetation type. Now, there's various levels of complexity and multiple ecological variables in the different types of like-for-like approaches. However, there's also some dangers. Black box, it's kind of a bit of a black box use of ecological parameters. There's a lack of, indicators and monitoring a lot of the time. And sometimes the management objectives can be a bit vague and contextual here. So there's some dangers of ad hoc or rule-based or score-based site selection. It's a bit inefficient, and it has been shown to sometimes even fail to protect biodiversity. There's much more efficient ways to do it, potentially, and much more effective. So say the authors, and their answer appears to be systematic conservation planning, coming with the key principles of complementarity and irreplaceability, which we can also call strategic offsetting. So complementary sites are sites that most effectively add underrepresented biodiversity to the existing network, whereas irreplaceable sites have rare biodiversity features. There's few or no alternatives for offsetting, so they are prioritized for retention. So the authors here exploring applying the principles of complementarity and irreplaceability, strategic offsetting. So they looked at the offset options for mining impacts on 569 flora and fauna species in Southeast Australia, outlining a CI, complementarity, irreplaceability, based approach using common modeling and spatial prioritization software. And then they anticipate the loss from development versus the gain from offsetting, quantify this for each species, and then they compare this for the like-for-like habitat method. So, speaking of methods, area was the Lower Hunter Valley, lovely area there in New South Wales. About 430,000 hectares, around 60% of it is native vegetation. Many features of national importance, including 17 endangered fauna species. Also includes open-cut coal mining, manufacturing, tourism, and a lot of agriculture. Current and pending coal titles cover about 90,500 hectares. It's about 21%, and overlap with areas of high biodiversity value. So, the authors took occurrence data from 569 threatened species. The species distributions were modelled using the program MaxEnt against a set of, for each species, ecologically relevant environmental variables, so vegetation, climate, topography, soil, things like that. They remodeled species distributions with the same variables for pre-European vegetation patterns as well. They went on to compile a vegetation condition layer, so vegetated versus disturbed, and various stages in between, I imagine, and a mining likelihood layer as well. They then went on to the spatial prioritization of offsets that they wanted to test with 6 scenarios. So for the CI method, 3 methods where one's 100% protection, 100% restoring, one and in combination, all run in zonation 4.0. And for the like-for-like approach, there was a protection only, a restore only, and a random offsetting, all tested in Marxan 2.4. And they ran all these scenario models and used the data to ID priority areas that satisfied the offsetting scenario. So, for example, CI sites are sites that are returning the total proportion of the original distribution of a species that was lost due to development. Like-for-like sites are trying to meet all of their veg type targets, and if not, a priority area is a site that meets all the achievable targets plus remaining areas for those veg types for which targets failed. To test cost impacts, they reran their CI models, assuming costs of restoring are 3 to 10 times higher than protection given the prior condition. Very interesting results. If they were to mine all of the coal titles, that'd be about 22% of the native vegetation cover in the area lost, including 8% in native protected areas. So there's a pretty direct linear impact on species distributions, right? 5% mining is about a 1.4% loss in species distributions. 100% brings it up to 21.9. Now there's a huge amount of variation in species. The superb lyrebird, if you on average, if you mine 100%, you lose 21.9%. For the superb lyrebird, it loses around 60% of its distribution. Same for vegetation. There's some species that will only lose around 0.6%. The red gum rough-barked apple forest will lose around up to 88% of its current species distribution. Pretty heavy. Now, if we were going to do, apparently, the CI offset mining, the CI offset method, we'd need anywhere for up to 64,050 hectares, depending on pressure. Now, I couldn't find a figure for the like-for-like on that, though figure 4C does show the ratio of offset to mined areas, and it doesn't look great. Anyway, we'll move on to the first scenario in our strategic offsetting, where we do protection only, and we end up losing 22% of total biodiversity. In scenario 2, with restoration only, if we're restoring 100%, it's the only way to really restore or improve biodiversity values to pre-development levels, but that depends on restoration success, and it comes with a 2 to 2.5 times higher cost. The combined method obviously brings the cost down to about 1.7 2 times, and an emphasis on restoration at low mining and protection at high mining pressure. It's very area efficient, the strategic method, whereas the like-for-like is very good at low mining pressure. However, after about 10% mining leases are cleared, there's no more space left to restore for more than 9 plant communities. So the like-for-like ends up failing the no net loss principle of at intermediate mining, with up to 11.3% biodiversity loss potential, whereas the strategic offsets improves biodiversity protection by about 10%, with worst off species getting about 13.7% more protection. The worst off species under the like-for-like actually get 4% less protection. Now, there's obviously a lot of limitations here. Variation in species distributions and spatial ecology. The additionality principle is very interesting. It implies that if we're going to offset that patch of forest, it implies that there was a threat to it. It's if I were to knock down a certain bunch of land and then offset a bunch of the moon, well, we were never going to knock down trees on the moon anyway. So that can kind of be that additionality principle can it's threat implicit, which is a bit interesting. Now, this is a quote here as well, and I think you might find this very interesting, Adrian. Uncertainty about the success of restoration undermines both strategies equally, right?
Yep.
So it depends on how well you actually end up doing the restoration of the site.
Absolutely.
And I guess obviously you guys try to do your best, but have you seen some poorly restored sites in your time, or do you guys end up going to a lot of terribly restored sites and kind of trying to fix them up, or?
We've inherited some, yeah. I mean, my problem with offsetting, I think I was saying this earlier, is that it's a great idea because before you had nothing.
Yeah.
Now at least you said that you're required to do something.
Yeah.
But unless you start doing it 30 years before you intend to actually use it, you're not kind of seeing the net gain, and it is assuming that you will achieve that, like for like along the way, which rarely happens because, there's intrinsic value to any site that you can't, replace. So
Does it seem almost more sensible to try to use that complementarity approach? I mean, like for like seems nice and easy. You've got these measures that you can kind of just plug in and go, but the strategic method kind of requires you to know the network of ecosystems that are there and what's already there that you can complement with, rather than just blindly matching like for like.
I mean, the idea of it, like, the overarching regional plan is a great idea. There's been a few kind of that I've heard about along the years, but putting it into practice is another thing. It's the same with wildlife corridors. They try and plan them. That they're a great idea, but they don't necessarily come to, or it can only take a change of government for previously protected areas to be completely wiped as well.
Right. So how do you get 30 years of protection to get that forest to get to a nice sort of mature stage with hollows and all those other structural features that fauna actually need for it to be functional?
Absolutely.
And can't you have setbacks with threatening processes like fire?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Droughts.
Floods, whatever.
Yeah, plenty of stuff.
Those things that really...
Yeah.
I mean, the irreplaceability, I really like that idea.
That you can't just do like for like. Sometimes there's going to be something there that is so unique that you're not going to find it.
Yeah.
You physically can't offset certain things.
And sometimes like for like isn't necessarily, that they probably factored that in at some point, but if you have, an open woodland where you have, 100,000 hectares of, reproducing that somewhere else isn't going to achieve as much as going, well, okay, this is all, say, some kind of open woodland, but there's a wetland ecosystem that we have, less than 2% left of. It would be better off to use, find some land where we could reproduce
and that'd be that
endangered
complementary
wetland
method. Yeah.
Yeah.
We need some more wetland here rather than some more woodland.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
You do need to factor in, what you're losing, how important it is. Otherwise, there's no point recreating a woodland that you already have plenty of already.
Yeah, exactly. Or just, growing a monoculture, which is useless for a lot of fauna. So another quote here that I thought was interesting: the like-for-like approach struggled to meet targets under moderate to high levels of mining. This raises the question of how unmet targets should be properly and transparently compensated. That was an interesting point to me. When if you do have an obligation to restore something like for like, if the company fails that, how do they? First of all, how do we make sure that that's transparently apparent, and then how is their compensation for that?
This invokes the completion criteria, which I don't know if it's the same language in a non-mine restoration, but that's where in mining there's a need to set completion criteria across veg soils, whether it's to do with the variety and the biodiversity and the species composition and cover and the whole gamut of characteristics. But those completion criteria being set at the start.
So they were, I guess, you would have to include in those completion criteria some of the if you are going to go the like for like method, you have to include some of the ecological parameters and indicators that you are using to define what is like and what is not.
Yeah,
you'd have to include those in the sorry, what was it called?
Yeah, completion criteria.
Completion criteria.
Yeah,
there you go.
Yeah, yes, and some of the challenges are around the soil spoil interface as well, where you've got dealing with new soils.
Right.
So pH around the condition of the soils to make sure that they're matching it. But that's where the concept of hybrid ecosystems has come in with research by David Doley and others out at UQ, I think elsewhere, but that brings to mind that concept that for years there has been this attempt to reproduce or restore ecosystems, and it's sort of rehab is then kind of, because of its completely changed substrate, how difficult that's been. So on those areas of bauxite mining or sand mining where you can replace the soils, where it's been more successful, to have native ecosystems come back more similar. But in those other areas where you've ended up with something completely different, I think, and failures, so all acacias die at 7 years or whatever. So there's plenty of examples of that where good intentions but no idea.
Yeah.
Plant a lot of acacias and it looks good for a while, or have a lot of ground cover or grow grasses that only short term, or wiped out in the fire and you've got nothing. So or it's invasive, like gamba grass in the tropics coming in.
Yeah.
Rum jungle's victim of gamba grass infestation. You can have very dense cover and very stable soils, and then suddenly fire comes through and it's like a billiard table. Nothing growing. So so completion criteria are challenging, but a lot of ecologists in mine rehab spend a lot of time either developing them that are site specific, or trying to achieve them once they've been set.
Yeah, well, in my experience, in terms of the completion criteria, that there's not a long-term monitoring. Most offset sites have, less than 5 years, and some of them only a couple of years. So long as it looks good for the first couple of years, it gets the tick,
Right.
and then they tend to walk away. What kind of monitoring do they?
That's a good question. I don't have anything to do with offsets, but I wondered then what happens when the mine closes to the offset, or have they completed their obligations at that point in time? Who inherits the offset? I don't know anything about offsets. I don't know how they're managed. But my ever-present question is, what happens at closure with that? How do you... who owns it? Even like cultural heritage artefacts that might be found before a mine they might be put in a keeping place, but what happens afterwards? Like all of these questions that I have. There are things that are done at the beginning, the things that are done as part of planning, but the tail end is missing. So I don't know.
Yeah, well, most of the offsets that we've worked on are usually on properties that have been acquired for the offset. But what happens in the long term? I mean, offsets are a relatively new thing, and that is my concern. That 20 years down the track, with how many changes of government, you can't be sure that area will be protected, even if it has achieved. I haven't heard about many offsets that have exceeded the original target, simply because they do the bare minimum. That is one of the other challenges.
I guess I guess it's one of those things. Again, you need to know the local ecology and at what stage something is going to be a mature, successful ecosystem. Like I said, Brigalow, 25, 30 years, you're kind of starting to get to a mature Brigalow regrowth system. That's kind of similar to all the remnant stuff, but there's other old growth forests out there that will take a lot longer than that.
Yeah, and that's part of the completion criteria, demonstrating it's sustainable.
Okay.
So.
In terms of wildlife, I mean, it's easy to go through and direct seed. Direct seeding is a lot easier on bare soil because you need sterile soil in order to get decent results out of direct seeding. Otherwise, you're just going to be fighting weeds, and you'll end up losing most of that seed anyway. But in terms of the wildlife coming back, I mean, obviously you can't incubate the eggs and then. I
don't know.
So there's a lot of important features in those, termite mounds, cracking soils, and things like that, falling over trees, all of these other features that make it really important.
Yeah,
the intrinsic value is really hard.
A fauna ecologist colleague, Liz Williams, she always said that the rehab was designed just for the veg, assuming the fauna would come, not designing the ecosystem for the fauna. There could be this fundamental problem with how we design rehab anyway, just assuming that you get grasses and trees and everything will sort itself out, whereas actually you've got to do the...
Well, you do need little bandicoots there to ecosystem engineer and transfer and dig soils and move seeds around and all these, birds that are moving, fruit seeds and, you're going to need pollinators in the area. That's that's a very complicated
in Germany
system.
They were bringing those things in ahead in the very early stages of rehab.
They're dumping fauna and butterflies and birds.
They had the beehives, they brought in ants' nests, they had the big long pole for the birds of prey.
Oh, excellent.
And they were bringing it all in, and I just haven't seen many mines, if any, maybe one. In the Hunter Valley I saw Mangoola, I think they tried to introduce some logs. But, We can do better.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, it
We can
depends
all-
on what's adjacent to the site. If you know, I've seen offsets that were surrounded by farmland. So in terms of the fauna recolonising,
Yeah, where are they going to come from?
That's right.
If there's no corridors going into it, then the only things that are going to get there will have to be, slowly moving across the ground or flying there. It's going to take a long time to repopulate and become of much fauna value.
That being said, I have seen some excellent koala translocation programs. Where they protected them in some cases. That they had some issues with wild dogs who were pretty much decimating a koala population just north of Brisbane there. And so through the offset, they actually translocated a lot of these koalas there. And the population is thriving now. So
That's fantastic news. Look, the more help that Southeast Queensland koalas get, the better, because they are struggling. Guys, I think that's about where we're going to have to leave it. We've got another research paper. There's so much more stuff to talk about. We'll have to get you back on sometime again if you're happy to come on again.
Yep.
No worries. Adrian, always a joy, my friend. Miss Corinne Unger, it's
thank
been
you,
an
honestly.
absolute pleasure.
No worries.
And
wonderful.
Great. Thanks.
I guess that's pretty much it, guys. Plenty more wildlife cake and cocktails coming up in the next couple of weeks. Keep your eyes peeled, and we'll be back shortly. Hopefully with some bird conservation featuring Mr. John Wojnarski. Cheers, guys. It's been a pleasure. All right, have a good one.
Thank you.
Cheers, y'all.
Thank
Bye.
you.